Hello, so today's video is all about the Canon 1DS Mark III, a camera that I've had since it was first launched in 2008, I believe. I've shot many thousands of frames with this camera now and many hundreds of professional photography assignments, all kinds of different things. To begin with, I'll just show you a few of the pictures that I've taken, a random selection of the pictures that I've taken with this camera over the years, and then I'll go on to talk about my opinions about it, some of the good things, some of the bad things, give you a bit of an overview of the camera. So here we go. So really, this camera has sat on the shelf for the last 5 years, pretty much. Occasionally it gets called out when I need kind of an extra body for something. And I've stuck this old 300mm f4 lens on it because it just kind of deserves to be paired with a beast of a camera like this, deserves to be paired with a bit of a beast of a lens. Now, I've taken it off the shelf and the last few assignments that I shot with this, the last few big assignments were actually on the beach. I think I shot one sailing assignment offshore, and then I shot some surfing and a few other things that were very salty environment. And I probably didn't clean it very well afterwards because I've just come to turn it on and everything is corroded on the camera. It has been for a while. This camera's had a really hard life, actually. All kinds of different abuse has been thrown at it. And I actually had to turn it on with a pair of pliers because the switch was so kind of corroded with salt. And then the tab there that holds the lens on was jammed up with gunk and salt and all sorts, and I've had to kind of leverage it open with my Leatherman. But I've done all of that. I've kind of opened and closed all of the switches a few times, and now it just works perfectly. You know, even after all these years, the battery's charged up perfectly fine, everything just works. And so to go right back in time, back to the beginning. So 2008 came along. I've been using the Canon 1DS Mark II before that, which was a great camera, but it was plagued with problems of just being heavy and tricky to use. And it had huge problems with calibration with lenses that I could never quite get over because you had to keep sending it back to Canon to be calibrated. Had huge problems with dust spots because it had no dust cleaning solution. So that 1DS Mark II was a pain in the backside for me, but it produced amazing pictures and it was kind of an introduction to full frame digital. Very expensive, very heavy camera. Along came the 1DS Mark III, and you know, this camera addressed a lot of those issues, and I was one of the first in line to buy it. And this camera is an expensive piece of equipment. I mean, back in the day, in 2008, I think I paid, was it late 2007? I can't remember exactly. I think I paid about £5,000 for it, maybe a little bit more, just for the body. And that was a lot of money then for me. You know, that was a big investment for the business, and it kind of had to be right. I remember going to the photography show at Birmingham NEC to buy it, so you could get a little bit of a discount. And I remember kind of almost like shaking hands, handing my credit card over because I knew what that kind of debt would mean. But I bought it and used it and have used it, you know, endlessly, and it's been a really amazing camera. Now the things that I'll talk about, so in many ways it's the worst camera in the world. Okay, so let's get all the bad stuff out of the way to begin with. If you're into video, this camera just doesn't do video, so forget that. This camera doesn't have a flippable screen. You can't do selfie modes on it. It doesn't have a touch screen. It's got nothing like that at all. It's just a pretty basic professional piece of camera equipment to take photographs with. Doesn't really have a fast motor drive. I think they say between 3 to 5 frames a second, and I'm not, you know, listen. It's not too shabby, right? It's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world. I've never had a problem with having not the fastest motor drive in the world. And I shoot quite a lot of sport. And you know, if you looked at some of the pictures, you'll see there's some sort of high point action of sport. I think timing is everything rather than just kind of being able to drop 20 frames per second. But high frame rate does help if you're into kind of wildlife or sports or that kind of thing, where, you know, certainly a faster motor drive will help you get pictures. So if you're into fast motor drive stuff, this thing's pretty slow by comparison. It's heavy, you know, it's solidly, this is a tank. This is a tank, and it's heavy and well built and robust, and I have put this camera through some really hard times. You know, whatever you're imagining a camera can go through in 10 years of hard, heavy professional use, this camera's probably been through it, from desert sands to mountains to rolling around in the sea to being on sailing boats to being probably tear gassed, and various other things have happened to this camera. It's really been, you know, dragged around and banged around and not cared for, but it's just solid, and it shows all kinds of signs of wear and tear, but it's never missed a beat. So two of the really good things that came in this camera that kind of maybe people are not aware of is, one was it was the first camera that had dust removal software inside. It actually somehow managed to remove the dust from the sensor, and that was brilliant. Coming from the 1DS Mark II, where you spent all your time dotting the dust out in the frames, this was amazing. So it was really cool. And the other thing that it had was in-body calibration for the lenses, either individually or collectively as a group of lenses. And that was amazing because it meant that you could fine-tune the lenses to the camera. And I had a lot of success doing that with this camera, and it just reduced the inaccuracy of the focusing or the lens to body kind of coordination, calibration. It just reduced it and made it workable. And that was great. And cameras now have those things built into them kind of more commonly. But those were two of the major reasons why I wanted to buy this camera. Now, the image quality, I think, is sensational still. You know, one of the first, you know, even now, kind of many years later, one of the first jobs I shot with this camera was to shoot a billboard for a university, and it was studio lit, so it was kind of low ISO and under controlled environments. But I shot some pictures of some students that were going to be used as a billboard on the side of the university, and I handed over the files once we'd selected the appropriate file, did the post-production, handed over a big TIFF file, and they printed it. And they printed it huge, really, really big. And a lot of times billboards are printed huge, but you're viewing them at a distance, you know, a long way away. So you can use actually quite a low resolution file and it'll still look fine. However, on this occasion, you could actually walk right up to the billboard and kind of scrutinize it, which I did. And, you know, I started off kind of 100 feet away thinking, oh, well, that looks quite good. But, you know, by the time I got to within 2 feet of it, it was still incredible. It's still incredible. And so it really highlighted to me the potential for this camera, the image quality, 21 megapixel sensor, I think, full frame. And so that kind of signified to me, whoa, this thing is a beast. You know, it's capable of some really amazing stuff. At roughly that same time, raw image manipulation software like Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw and various others were sort of, they've been around for a while, but they were beginning to pick up speed because the files from the cameras were getting better. And so rather than just digital post-production sort of being a game to, you know, to make the picture look as good as it could be, there started to become a lot more potential for actually editing the most out of the file and actually improving the picture and really pulling out the shadows and adjusting and applying different color techniques and different toning techniques. And really, this was the first camera, I think, where I really began to shoot for that post-production style. So sometimes I'd underexpose the file because I knew that I could pull and push this file from this camera. It's like dough, you know, whereas a sort of JPEG from many cameras is like a biscuit. The raw file from this one is like a great big slab of dough being thrown down, and you could knead it around and you could manipulate it and you could make some really great effects and get some really nice tones and colors from this camera. So it's the first camera that really opened, this and the Canon 5D Mark II, I suppose, were the first cameras that opened my eyes to that idea of, you know, of making the most of your pictures by adjusting the raw files. and this certainly had enough, and still does have enough potential within the raw file to really be able to adjust it and make the most of your pictures. And there was a lot of depth to the file, and still is now. The next thing that I want to talk about is the actual just look of the file out of the camera is really nice. It reminds me, I just shot a few frames with it just now, and it just reminds me of the Leica. It reminds me of the Leica M9 in so many ways, the colour. I always thought that the files out of the older Canon cameras, the 5D Mark II, maybe the 5D Mark III, I always thought straight out of the camera they had a certain beauty about them, which, while the newer files still look great, there's just a kind of difference. It's just a kind of slightly more filmic look, maybe. It's quite difficult to articulate, but you know, I always like the files out of here. And these things are all subjective. Everyone will have different opinions about these things. So it's simple. That's another thing that's so lovely about this camera. Just picking it up now, after I was playing with Canon R5 recently, and it's, you know, the R5 is an amazing camera. It's so complicated in, you know, in all the right ways, actually, that you know, you need to set that camera up for the specific use that you have for it, and then it will be amazing. But this is just kind of really rather basic, and I'm pretty basic, so I really quite like that kind of aspect to these older cameras. There are buttons that clearly do what you want them to do. The menu system is just refreshingly simple. You know, if you've picked up any camera from the last sort of, well, maybe the last decade, maybe certainly the last 5 or 6 years, the menu systems have become increasingly complicated, partly because of having, you know, video as a capability. So partly the complexity isn't just for no reason, it's because the cameras are capable of doing more, but just from a very simplistic perspective, the actual basic controls of this camera are sort of really rather similar to cameras going back, you know, way back into the film days. Having said that, this camera has a very, very functional autofocus system. There's nothing shabby about it at all. You know, it hasn't got the kind of ability to spread the focus zones across the whole frame, or do eye focus, or do any of those kind of jazzy things. But it does have the ability to just kind of move the focus probably where you need it to be, which is either from the center or sort of to the top third or the bottom third, or the you know, kind of those simple AF spot adjustments that actually I use all the time, rather than this kind of ultimately complex autofocus systems. It has AI servo, which tracks focus really well, and it has one shot which locks onto focus really well. Another thing that's great about this camera is that it has a beautifully bright viewfinder that you look through. I think it's still as bright as pretty much anything that's out there at the moment. And, you know, it fits into the hand really nicely. If you've got big hands like I have, and you like using big lenses, fast primes or telephoto lenses, there's a certain beauty to a camera that's got a bit of heft to it, and you can really get your hand around it, and it has this vertical grip, which has always been very nice for shooting portraits. And you know, the grip is really chunky and fits into my hand, and it's tough. You know, there's certain shoots that I've done in my life where I would really, you know, I really value having a hefty camera with me, because it just feels like the right tool for the job, and it definitely feels like a tool, that's for sure. It doesn't feel like, you know, a lot of modern cameras are really rather flimsy and small with little buttons, and you know, even though they might actually be really reliable and last really well, there's a certain kind of beauty to the heft of this. And you know, it won't be for everybody. You know, there'll be lots of people that this camera is definitely not for, that's for sure. And you know, part of the reason for me doing this video is just sort of revisiting old cameras and talking about them and giving my true honest opinion and thoughts, having used it extensively in my life as a professional photographer. Okay, so who's it for? Well, pretty much anybody really. You know, you could shoot landscape photography with this really, really well. You could shoot sports, but it's a little bit slow in terms of the autofocus. Portraits, I think this is an amazing camera. The 1DS stood for studio, I believe, which meant that it was higher resolution and a bit slower in operation. And so for a studio photographer, I still think that this camera is exceedingly good. You have this screen on the back. There's nothing jazzy about it, but what it does do is enable you to get critical focus. So if you're using the live view, it's only manual focus. There's nothing kind of bells and whistles about it at all, but what you can do is to get critical focus by zooming in, and that's actually quite useful for some circumstances. If you were shooting macro, for example, or you're shooting in the studio, that kind of critical focus using manual can be really helpful. The battery, just, you know, this battery is the original battery that came with the camera. I had two, only ever had two, and I never needed more. Even on sort of the longest shoot day ever, because they're pretty chunky. One died, I don't know why, just doesn't work anymore. This is probably the original battery that came with the camera. Still charges up fine, still works, still seems to hold charge kind of for a reasonable period of time. And it has dual card slots, which is very cool. You know, you can back up all your pictures, shoot both. I always shoot to both cards in RAW, and that's very, very helpful. And there's a lot of cameras that are on the market today that are kind of sort of high-end amateur / professional cameras that cost a lot of money that only have one card slot. And that to me is kind of not really the best way to, certainly if you're working professionally, you know, I think it's best to have dual cards if you can. What else can I say about it? There'll be a lot of people that won't like this camera. You know, it doesn't do a lot of the things that some of the more modern cameras will do, but I think, you know, is it still relevant in 2021 or 2025 or wherever we are? Yeah, I think it is. You know, I think you could learn a lot with a camera like this and take some incredible pictures. I don't think the pictures that you would take with a camera like this would hinder you in terms of your photography journey. The ISO ability is one of the reasons why I upgraded. It kind of topped out at 1600 with an option to extend to 3200, but 3200 was quite noisy, so 1600 was okay, it's fine. You can do a lot with 1600. So that was one of the main reasons why I upgraded, and smaller cameras, the 5D Mark III came along, better ISO, smaller body, better autofocus. I never went down the road of the 1DX. I've used the 1DX quite extensively, but this was kind of the last of the 1D series that I invested in. And I think in many ways, you know, I know that the 1DX Mark II and Mark III are very capable cameras, but they're still very expensive. Which leads me on to the last point, which is worth thinking about. Now, I paid over £5,000 for this camera. I think I bought it with an extra battery and a flash gun, and I think the final bill was nearly £6,000 if I remember rightly. It's just so much money. I just looked on a couple of second-hand used sites, and I found one for £350. A bit battered like this, probably less battered than this actually. This is probably the most battered 1DS Mark III in the world. Maybe not. I've seen some that have got the grips peeling off and all of the paint off the top, so maybe this isn't too bad, but it has had a hard life. And all in all, I just think it's an amazing camera, and the fact that you can now buy one of these for £350, rising up there, I looked on a couple of other sites, so sort of 350 to probably about £600 is kind of a price target-ish. Maybe you pay a bit more for a ready mint one. Whether or not this camera is right for you, you have to do your own research and come to your own conclusion. I will keep it forever, probably, because it's a great backup camera. I would have no hesitation if I had all of my cameras stolen, and which is something that I live in constant fear of, and I had a shoot that was imminent and I had to do before I could get hold of replacement equipment, I'd have no hesitation in using this camera at all on 99% of my shoots. I'd rather use newer technology, that's for sure, because they enable me to do maybe a few more different things. But actually, this camera is still hugely capable and certainly not to be written off in any way, shape or form. I really hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Please do subscribe. I'm very grateful to anybody who has recently subscribed or has commented on any of my other videos. You don't know how much it means, actually. It really does mean the world to me to know that people enjoy the content that I make. I've got a lot more things that I want to do. So thank you for watching. Goodbye.